All Hit Radio.
Welcome to the X Zone, a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. Now, here's your host, Rob McConnell.
Welcome back, everyone. This is the X Zone. We're coming to you from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Worldwide, toll-free 800-610-7035. Email xzone at xzoneradiotv.com. On all social media sites, X Zone Radio TV, and our website, www.xzoneradiotv.com. A couple of notes from our newsroom. A patient at University Health Centre in Toronto has been hospitalized in an isolation ward and being tested for Ebola, along with other illnesses, after coming down with a fever following travel from West Africa. The Health Network's VP of Public Affairs says it's unlikely that the patient has Ebola and called the test a precaution. Having said that, we have a petition online where we're asking the Prime Minister of Canada, the Minister of Public Safety, the members of Parliament to stop, deny anyone traveling into Canada or en route to Canada from a hot spot in Africa where there is Ebola confirmation or suspected Ebola virus. Don't let them back into Canada, whether they're a visitor, whether they're a Canadian, until we have eradicated Ebola. If you'd like to sign our petition, as soon as you sign it, a copy goes to the Prime Minister of Canada, the Minister of Public Safety, as well as the MPs, instantaneously. The website is www.stopebolapetition.com. My guest this hour is a gentleman we've had the pleasure of having on the show a number of times, a good friend of the X Zone. Kevin Randle is his name. He is a retired U.S. Army lieutenant colonel who's toured in Iraq. He has a master's degree in psychology and the art of military science, as well as a doctorate in psychology. His Army and Air Force training as an intelligence officer, military police officer, and in public affairs brings a unique insight into the operations and protocols of the military and its investigations into UFOs and related phenomenon. He has been interviewed he's interviewed hundreds of witnesses to mysterious crashes, sightings, abduction cases, animal mutilation, alien home invasions, and humans working with the aliens. He has a great book out, X Zone Nation. It's called The Government UFO Files, The Conspiracy of Cover-Up. Joining me now is our friend Kevin D. Randle. And Kevin, welcome back to the X Zone. It's been a bit of a time since you've been with us, but congratulations on your new book.
Well, thank you very much. And, of course, I blame you for the long delay in me getting back.
Yeah, okay, I'll take that. I deserve that. I deserve that. Hey, I'll take it. Tell us a little bit about your book. And, you write so many books, my friend. What's this book about?
This is a look at government files, documentation for UFOs. Mm-hmm. And what I find interesting about the whole thing, and what excited me about this, is I learned that the UFO phenomena, as we think of it, the modern era, didn't really begin with the Arnold sighting in June of 1947, but actually begins with the Foo Fighters during World War II. And there was a great deal of concern about these Foo Fighters simply because on our side, we perceived them as maybe some sort of enemy weapon, whether it was German or Japanese.
Right.
And if that was the case, we needed to be able to combat them. So they set up a number of studies to try to determine what they were. And the Foo Fighters really were more than just the lights in the sky that they talk about or the balls of light following aircraft. In some cases, they saw actual structured craft. They saw large craft. They fired on them innumerable times, and oftentimes the bullets would either sort of be absorbed by them or they would bounce off. So you're dealing with a structured or a solid craft. But what was interesting is one of the guys involved in this investigation was an intelligence officer, an American intelligence officer named Howard McCoy. When the war ended, of course, the nature of this became irrelevant to everybody because there was no more enemy, so they didn't see it as a critical thing to investigate. But in 1946, we started with the ghost rockets, what we're seeing over Scandinavia, and then Northern Europe and into Southern Europe. And that worried the Scandinavians a great deal, and they thought it might be a Soviet attempt to intimidate them by flying these things over their country so that they would be more neutral and maybe could be manipulated by the Soviets. Of course, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we learned that wasn't true. But one of the guys working on this from the American point of view was a guy named Howard McCoy.
All right, we're going to have a bit of a cliffhanger here, my friend, because we have to take a commercial break. Exonation, my guest this hour, Kevin D. Randle. He's got a brand new book out entitled The Government UFO Files, The Conspiracy of Cover-Up. Plus, we're going to be talking to Kevin this hour about the great MJ-12 debate that's going on. Kevin Randle is our guest. We'll both be back on the other side of this commercial break as we continue here in the X-Zone from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. If you want information on Ebola, go to cdc.gov or Health and Welfare Canada. We'll be back on the other side of this commercial break. Don't go away. Welcome back, everyone. Kevin D. Randle is my guest. We're talking about his new book, The Government UFO Files, The Conspiracy of Cover-Up. Kevin, what was Project Saucer?
That was the cover name for Project Sign. And to kind of touch back where we were, we had Howard McCoy investigating the ghost rocket.
Right.
And we'll get to Project Saucer in just a moment.
Sure.
In December of 1946, McCoy is tasked with an unofficial investigation of these flying aerial phenomenon in the United States. He's at Wright Field. He sets up an unofficial investigation in December of 1946. It's like 6-7 months before Arnold has his sighting. So he's investigating these things prior to that. When we get to Arnold, then the sightings, of course, blow up around the United States. There was a mini estimate of the situation was done. Brigadier General Shogun had written about a number of UFO sightings and sent this to Wright Field to Twining to take a look at. Twining then issued the letter from September 23rd, 1947, says the phenomenon are something real, not visionary and fictitious. The guy who drafted the letter is Howard McCoy. Same guy.
Wow.
So he's involved in all of this stuff. So Twining says we need to start a classified investigation. It's called Project Sign originally, but they tell the public we're investigating as Project Saucer. So they're not fully keyed into what's going on. The public doesn't know exactly what the Air Force is doing or what they're investigating. Project Sign eventually evolved into Project Grudge, and Project Grudge evolved into Project Blue Book. So the investigation started officially started in January of 1948, although the files begin with Arnold, but the official investigation began some 6 months later, and it goes through December of 1969 with this investigation, which ended up as being basically public relations. The case that really demonstrates what the Air Force was doing was the Portage County chase, which I call the Close Encounters chase, and that's the police officers chasing the thing across parts of Ohio into Pennsylvania.
Right.
They see it originally in the western sky, and it crosses over them, and then they begin chasing it. And the Air Force says, well, what they saw was a satellite, and then when the satellite was out of view, then they picked up Venus, and they were chasing Venus. But if you read the Project Blue Book file, they knew the satellite end of it didn't work because there were no satellites visible in that part of the sky over the United States at the time it began. They knew it because the documentation is in the files telling us that. And then, of course, there's one drawing where they show the moon, they show Venus, and they show the object. So clearly they'd seen Venus as well. But that just demonstrates that the Air Force was busy explaining sightings, and they didn't care where the explanations worked. They just wanted an explanation so they could say, we solved that case. So that kind of, but the history is all strung together by this Howard McCoy guy who knew what was going on from the Foo Fighters up through the beginnings of Project Sign.
In your opinion, why was Project Blue Book canned?
Public relations. It was getting out of hand. People were not listening to what Project Blue Book had to say. They realized the explanations were silly. So they came up with this idea. And again, this is laid out in the book because there's something called the Hitler letter. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, and he writes to the Condon Committee, which investigated UFOs for the Air Force in the late 1960s, saying, this is what you want. We want you to do. Say a couple of positive things about the Air Force investigation. Say it doesn't impact on national security, and then we can end Project Blue Book. So we don't have to deal with it anymore. We can say we've investigated and we found nothing that affects national security. We don't investigate them. If you feel threatened, call the local university or call your local law enforcement. So that was the mission at that time to end Project Blue Book. And the Air Force is pretty much stuck with it. But what they didn't tell anybody was there was something called Project Moondust. And I actually found Project Moondust files in the Project Blue Book files, which is something that nobody had ever mentioned before. They're really cruddy sightings, but they're mentioned in the Project Blue Book files. But Moondust had a task, one of its missions. It was designed to retrieve returning space debris of foreign manufacture or unknown origin, and of course unknown origin incorporates UFOs, and then we know that there was a UFO component because we found documents in the Project Blue Book files relating to the UFO sightings, but since that time, the State Department has released other documents that talk about UFO sightings and that sort of thing. And the Air Force was caught lying about that as well. A senator from New Mexico, Jeff Bingaman, wrote to the Air Force and said, what can you tell me about Project Moondust? And the Air Force wrote back and said, there's no such project. When the documents were presented to them, they said, oh yeah, well, we had this project, we never used it. Well, that was just another lie. But Moondust continued on till 1985, when the name was inadvertently compromised when the State Department dumped a bunch of documents on Robert Todd, and he found the name Project Moondust. And when Todd tried to find out what the project name was, they told him, well, it has a new name and it's now properly classified. So since 1985, we haven't found out what that investigation is.
How about the FBI? Have they been involved in UFO investigations?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And they were brought in originally to help investigate the backgrounds of UFO witnesses. The Rhodes sighting from July of 1947, he photographed a craft that looks amazingly like Arnold's original drawing of it, and the Air Force didn't want, or the Army Air Forces at the time, didn't want anybody to know they were involved. An FBI agent went with the Air Force guy to visit Rhodes, and the FBI guy flitched his credentials and just gave the name but identified him as military. But they were involved in that. They got angry at something, so they said they weren't going to do it. But in the book, I talk about a FBI agent's report from 1960, and he had gone to the convention or a lecture given by, I think it's George Van Tassel, given the description. They cross out all the names, and I think it's Van Tassel, in Denver. And he writes a full report to J. Edgar Hoover about what he'd observed at this UFO lecture that he had attended. So clearly the Air Force, or the FBI, was involved in these investigations, and may continue to do so under various guises.
Is it possible that the infamous Men in Black were actually FBI agents?
I'm not sure about that, and,
okay.
And here's why. I know when Rex Heflin took his pictures of the object there in Santa Ana, California, he said that two officers from NORAD had come and confiscated the pictures from him. He eventually got them back, and I think Ann Druffel has them. But I don't think they were Air Force officers. I think they were somebody else masquerading as Air Force officers. So it's very possible that some of these encounters with the Men in Black could have been FBI agents attempting to gather information without revealing exactly who they were.
In your opinion, what is the most positive proof case that UFOs are real, based on your many years as a UFO researcher?
If you're looking at a preponderance of testimony,
yeah,
then you have to look at the Roswell case because there were so many people involved in that sort of thing.
How about physical evidence?
When you change it I think the Leveland case from 1957 is very exciting because you had, again, multiple witnesses in many different locations. They're describing the electromagnetic effects that affected the car engines and stalled the car engines, dimmed their lights. And then the next day you had a number of sightings at White Sands Missile Range, and there's some interesting things going on there that I'm trying to get a handle on. But the Leveland sightings become very important, and there's discussion that the sheriff from Leveland actually was at the site where the object had touched down and left landing traces behind. But everybody was so busy arguing about how many witnesses there were and whether UFOs were real that nobody really did a good on-site investigation in 1957. So now we're left with talking to the sheriff's family, who tells us about those sorts of things. Don Burleson, who lives in Roswell, had done a lot of that work about 15 years ago, talking to the family of the sheriff, and that he had been asked by the Air Force not to talk about it. And so that he said, well, I didn't get very close. And it turns out he'd been much closer. He'd gotten a very good look at it and described it as an object. And that there's a possibility there was landing traces. And think of the scientific advantage we could have gained by a case where you've got multiple witnesses independent of one another talking about electromagnetic effects and what's going on there and landing traces. So you've got multiple chains of evidence that would lead us to possibly the extraterrestrial conclusion had the evidence been gathered in 1957. But you also look at a number of sightings from around the world that have not been properly investigated that leave us with all those sorts of things, possible photographs, possible landing traces, and it's just everybody is so busy arguing about the reality of it, nobody's gathering the information at the proper time in a proper scientific method.
But isn't it also true, Kevin, that when it comes to the distribution of information within the UFO community, it's very rare that this information is shared? Everybody wants to be the group, the organization, or the researcher that finds the smoking gun.
There is some of that. I know in the limited number of people I deal with, we share information all the time.
Yeah, but you're a professional, Kevin.
I know that some of us have been a little bit reluctant to share specific information immediately, wanting the right to publish it ourselves and get the proper credit for it. But it's usually a matter of months before that information comes out, and it's got to be properly gathered and properly vetted. So we want to take it slow. But I can't think of a time that I have ever refused to provide information to anybody who's asked.
But you see, Kevin, you're a professional. You have law enforcement training, and one of the biggest keys to success in law enforcement is sharing information.
Oh, absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. And I've always felt, people criticize Len Stringfield for his status reports on crash retrievals. And talking to Len, he said to me at one point, he says, I don't have time to look at all this stuff, but I put the information out there because it may key something somebody else has and may lead to a discovery.
And he's right.
So and if you understand what he's doing, then it makes perfect sense. I don't have a lot of good information about this case. I'm not sure it's a good case, but here's what I have in case it dovetails with something you have.
That's the way the intelligence. That's the way the intelligence agency works. Listen, you and I have got to take our news break at the bottom of the hour, Kevin. Great talking to you, my friend. Kevin D. Randle is my guest. His new book, The Government UFO Files, The Conspiracy of Cover-Up. Kevin and I return on the other side of this news break from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Don't go away. Welcome back, everyone. Kevin D. Randle is our special guest. What's your website now, Kevin?
It's still kevinrandle.blogspot.com.
There you go.
It's called A Different Perspective. You type a different perspective in your search engine, it usually comes up first.
Super. Before we get on to our next topic, which is going to be the controversy that is brewing on the MJ-12, what, in your opinion, is the most riveting part of your book?
Oh, my Lord. This book excited me because it sort of changes the ufological history.
It does.
From beginning with Arnold, but actually beginning 5 or 6 years before Arnold, and takes it all the way through and connecting all the dots, showing that there had been a government, and I hate to use the word conspiracy, to keep the information suppressed. But that's exactly what they were doing. During World War II, it makes perfect sense. You don't want your enemies to know what the heck you're doing.
Yeah.
With the Ghost rocket, it makes some sense because the Swedish government was afraid of infuriating the Russians. When we get to Arnold, they're looking at this stuff, they're investigating this stuff, they're not really sure what's going on, but then 2 weeks later, you have the crash in Roswell. Now they understand what's going on, and they want to keep that secret, so they've got to suppress the information about UFOs to get people away from investigating. And I think it gets it's looking at the history and how it all has kind of come together to create the situation we find ourselves in today.
The MJ-12 controversy that is on the internet. Tell me about it.
I had done a long analysis of MJ-12, looking at it from the very beginning and concluding that it's a hoax. And I think that the information that we've developed kind of proves it. There are problems with the Eisenhower briefing document, for example. There's a fatal flaw in it, that if the information is not true, then that shows that the entire Eisenhower briefing document is untrue. And so we laid all this stuff out, and Stan Friedman, who's the proponent of MJ-12, right up there with the Woods, Ryan Wood and Bob Wood, believe that MJ-12 is legitimate. And so Stan, of course, looked at this analysis, which had like 150 footnotes in it or something, and he pulled up a single line and said, well, Randle's wrong about this. Like that really, that's the best you can do. And what happened is, and a lot of people who correspond with me know the computer does this. My computer tends to highlight stuff and delete it. And I don't know why. I do not understand this flaw. And usually I catch it and I can put it back. Or if I don't catch it, you've got sentences jammed together or paragraphs jammed together that don't make sense. You can say, what's the problem here? And you can fix it. Well, what it highlighted was some stuff about the Cutler-Twining memo and deleted it. So it looked like I was saying that the Cutler-Twining memo had been signed by Twining, and there was an S in the Cutler-Twining onion skin that would be part of the file. And Stan, of course, jumped on that for being wrong. Well, it had cut out the part I was discussing another memo that Cutler had actually signed that did that. So it looked like I was saying that. So that is an error that appears in the analysis. But I've got all this stuff about the beginning of MJ-12, the Aquarius document, which was the first document that mentions MJ-12 that Stan doesn't deal with. I've got the stuff that Bill Moore and Richard Doty and Bob Pratt had written a book in 1980 that they called Magic 12. It was a work of fiction. And that was what the title that Pratt put on it, but Moore, when he looked at the manuscript, scratched it out and called it the Aquarius Project or Project Aquarius, something like that. So here's all of MJ-12 laid out in a work of fiction 2 years before the papers arrive at the home of Jamie Shandera. And then you have Bill Moore telling people, and told Stan Friedman. Stan Friedman actually told me this, and he now denies he said it to me, was that Moore had run into a brick wall in his investigations, and he was thinking about creating a Roswell-type document that he could show to people and convince them that it was all right for them to talk to him about the crash at Roswell. I know he he suggested the idea to Brad Sparks, for example, and Brad Sparks told him this was really a horrendous idea.
Yeah.
Don't do it. And yet, 2 years later, he gets the MJ-12 document, which lays all of this stuff out. Well, looking at the document, there's a second crash that supposedly took place on December 6, 1950. It's the story actually was told originally by a guy named Robert Willingham, who claimed to be an Air Force officer, retired Air Force officer and fighter pilot. When I looked into the guy's background, he was not an Air Force officer. He was not a fighter pilot. The original story he told actually said the crash took place in 1948. Not 1950 as it says in the Eisenhower briefing document. When I talked to Willingham, he said, no, that Todd Zeckel had made up the 1950 date, that it actually took place in 1954 and 1955. Well, if it is A, a hoax, B, if Willingham invented it, then it couldn't appear in the Eisenhower briefing document because it's a hoax. It was made up long after that document was supposedly written. And even if the story was true, it was it happened after the MJ-12 document was supposedly written. So I told Stan that, and he says, well, I think Willingham is a liar, but the story is true. And I said, do you have any evidence of that? And he, of course, said absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. My rejoinder to that is, unless you have something else, then absence of evidence is, in fact, evidence of absence until you can provide something else. And we've looked for evidence of this crash in the El Indio Guerrero area of Mexico. We've looked for this stuff. The story clearly was first published in Skylook, the precursor to the MUFON Journal, in March of 1968. I found the original story that Willingham told, and it's nothing like the story that appears in the MJ-12 document. It's been modified, and it talks about 3 craft, and it talks about 1948. Then they moved the date to 1950. If that's a flaw, if that's not true, then the entire document is flawed. Bill Moore actually said at one point that the MJ-12 documents contain real information and disinformation. So Bill Moore himself is criticized the document as being partially disinformation. The other thing that Stan does not talk about is when he first got the document, he gave it to a question document expert named Peter Teitel. He's in New York. In fact, when the George W. Bush National Guard papers were first circulated, CBS called Teitel to verify them, and Teitel, when he called them back and says, yes, I'm here, they said, never mind, we've taken care of it. So they didn't allow him to vet the papers, which they should have done. But Teitel is the guy that Stan Friedman called. Teitel told Stan to wash his hands of it because this is an obvious hoax. And he said the Truman memo that accompanied the Eisenhower briefing document, the signature for Truman is way too low in the text. Truman had a habit of signing the letters, the memos, all of this stuff with a cross on the T that went into the text of the message. And if you look at the Truman signature on that, you can see slight dips in the crossbar of the T where they had to modify it slightly to remove the parts of the letters that they didn't want people to see. So it's clearly a hoax. Peter Teitel has said it's a hoax. He's found a couple of what he calls slam dunks proving it's a hoax. And yet here we are, 30 years later, still arguing about this thing that has done absolutely nothing for UFO field other than divert attention. Well, when I came out with my long analysis, Stan, of course, felt that he had to respond. And one of his responses, which cracks me up, he says, well, I've always admired Kevin because he comes up with these great fiction scenarios in his books. And I'm thinking, do you say the same thing to Bruce Maccabee or Nick Pope or Whitley Strieber, who also have written works of fiction when you're discussing their UFO material, or is that excuse just left for me?
But I think in this case, Stan saw that if, based on your research, the MJ-12 papers are discredited and they're actually exposed as a hoax, the amount of credibility that he has put into these papers puts everything that he has ever done and stood behind in question.
Well, I think that when we look at the totality of the UFO phenomena as it exists today, there's a lot of stuff that we have to look at again. Dick Hall did a book in 1964 called The UFO Evidence, and it's sort of was the standard of ufological research. But as I've looked at some of the cases that he wrote about in there, and he was using the best information available at the time, we find great holes in it. And I think that in the entire UFO field, we've got to look at the information from primary sources and see if it corresponds with what the writers say or the investigators say to make sure we understand the entire picture. So Stan, we need to look at what his research is, but you have to look at what my research is as well.
Of course.
You know, did I make a mistake here? Did I do this wrong? Did I draw this faulty conclusion? You've got to look at the totality of the whole thing and make sure you've got it right. And that was why I attempt to footnote everything heavily so you can see where the information was drawn. But there's always things that go wrong, no matter how careful you are. And like I said, this great whopping huge paper, and I must have read it, like 15 times to make sure everything was right and everything was footnoted. I didn't catch that glitch that makes this one statement inaccurate, and it's one statement out of the entire paper. And Stan avoids talking about Peter Teitel. He avoids talking about the lack of provenance. We don't know where the damn thing came from. And when you're doing question document research, if there is no provenance, if you cannot trace it back to a source, if you cannot go to an independent organization to get that information, then there's a real problem with it. And we overlook that stuff. When we find errors in the paper, such as this Willingham UFO crash, well, we overlook that. Well, Willingham's not telling the truth, but the crash is real. I'll prove it. Stan says there was a crash on the plains of San Augustine and believes in the Aztec crash now. Why aren't those in the MJ-12 paper then? And the answer he gives in today's environment is, well, it was a draft of a paper, and so they didn't put everything in because they only had a few minutes to talk to the president about this topic. But if you've got appendices that have all this other ancillary information in it, then why aren't those things mentioned if they're real? And if they're not mentioned, then does that mean that they didn't happen the way it's been described? So you've got to take a look at all of that sort of thing. And I think when the dust settles eventually on MJ-12, we're going to find out that it's not true. It's been a red herring for 30 years. It's sucked up an awful lot of resources and research time.
So, once again, if it is accepted that the MJ-12 papers are in fact bogus, what will this do to the credibility of research that Stan has done?
It's going to impact the research. It's going to impact the credibility. It has to. But we have to take it. If Stan comes out and said, "Well, I was wrong on that," then you take a different tone. I mean, I blew it on Frank Kaufman. I believe the guy was telling the truth. But on the other side of the coin, it was my colleagues and me who blew the whistle on Kaufman, proving that his story wasn't true. So we continue the research. So you can always, you look at stuff continuously. Yeah. I believe the cattle mutilations have a terrestrial explanation.
What is it?
I believe there's stuff going on, but it's terrestrially based. It's not aliens doing it. But I look at it periodically to make sure that there hasn't been something new discovered or something else going on, to make sure that analysis stands. And so, that's the thing with research. I was just watching a documentary yesterday on Einstein, and in his theory of relativity,
yes,
he realized the math didn't work. There was a mistake in the math. He caught it and fixed it. But the point was, he had to work very hard to make sure the math was correct. And then when some of the experimentation was done, the experiments didn't validate his theory until they looked at it very, very specifically and very, very carefully with very specific information and realized, yes, it has been validated. But that's the thing with research. It's a continual process of learning, trying to discover what's going on. And as you become entrenched with an opinion, and you will not retreat from that opinion at any time, then it hurts your whole body of research.
In your opinion, how significant are the MJ-12 papers to ufology?
They are useless because they are untrue. There is not anything in them. In fact, if you look at the Eisenhower briefing document and you understand the history of ufology, you realize that they were written in the mid-1980s because they reflect the mood of ufology in the mid-1980s. You can date them that way when they were actually created. If they were true, I mean, we would be having a different discussion. The problem with the MJ-12 papers is they've taken up way too much time. They should be a footnote, and there's a lot of things that should be a footnote in ufology. The contactee should be a footnote in ufology, because clearly there is not a civilization on Venus. Clearly there's not a civilization on Mars, which the contactees we're talking about. So our science has outstripped those stories from the 1950s.
Kevin, we've got to take our final break. Please stand by. Exonation Kevin D. Randle is our special guest. His new book, The Government UFO Files, The Conspiracy of Cover-Up. All you have to do is put his name into any search engine and all the information will come up. We'll be back on the other side of this break. Don't go away. Kevin D. Randle is our special guest. His new book, The Government UFO Files, The Conspiracy of Cover-Up. Kevin, where can listeners get a copy of your book?
Amazon.com. If they want it immediately, they can get it downloaded from Kindle. It's in the bookstores, the bricks and mortar stores. So it's available in a wide variety of venues.
Just getting back to the MJ-12 papers for a minute or two, Kevin. When it comes to the world of skeptics that have always been looking for flaws within the UFO community to take the entire community down, is this going to, the fact that the MJ-12 papers are in fact bogus, is this going to put a bullet in their gun?
I don't think so, and I think the reason it's not going to is often with the skeptics, they know that there is no alien visitation. Anything that suggests otherwise must be untrue, and so they will attack it. But the real analysis of the MJ-12 documents have been done by the UFO researchers. Barry Greenwood has done a lot of work. Brad Sparks has done a lot of work, and they've published their findings. So if the skeptical community comes at us, we can say, yeah, we looked at this stuff. Here's what we have said for a long time about it. And we can point to the skeptical community where they made stuff up. They've created controversy when none is deserved. So I think that because of the number of UFO researchers who have looked at this thing and have not been suckered in by it, I think that it really doesn't hurt the overall UFO research.
In your opinion, UFO sightings up or down?
Well, I was of the opinion they were down, but it seems that Peter Davenport and his network are seeing a lot more sightings than there used to be, and I think MUFON is actually talking about sightings being up. So I think we're on an upswing. But we also have to kind of look at what are really UFOs and what are misidentifications. Exactly.
I think when it comes to someone who's doing research into ufology, there needs to be there should be, in my opinion, a standard of training that is given to one and all. Training instead of just going on the internet, reading a few cases, and calling yourself a UFO researcher.
Well, I think those people who have an investigative background, whatever that investigative background happens to be, are able to look at the cases and look at the reports with a more critical eye than someone who hasn't had that sort of training. But even with that, I think there's a real need for people to get out in the field and talk to the witnesses and ask every question. Don't just ask the questions you want the answers to, but ask every question, even if you might not like the answer.
Kevin, once again, give our listeners your website, my friend.
It's kevinrandle.blogspot.com. It's called A Different Perspective. I think if you type my name in, it comes up quickly, and if you type in A Different Perspective, I think that comes up quickly. In fact, the latest entry is on MJ-12 and Howard McCoy and how his name should have appeared on the document. So
Wow.
it's kind of linked into what we were talking about.
Exonation, Kevin's new book is entitled The Government UFO Files, The Conspiracy of Cover-Up. It's available on Amazon.com in both print and Kindle and at bookstores everywhere. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a great pleasure, and I promise you, my friend, it will not be as long between visits that we have you back here on the show. Take care of yourself and be safe.
Thank you, and the same to you.
Good night, Kevin. Exonation,
Night.
once again, my guest this hour, Kevin Randle. His new book, The Government UFO Files, The Conspiracy of Cover-Up. It's out now, but it would make a perfect Christmas gift for anyone who has the slightest bit of interest in UFOs, conspiracies, or cover-ups. I'll be back on the other side of this commercial break with the news at 6.5 minutes past the top of the hour as the X-Zone continues from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. My name is Rob McConnell. I'll be back.